it going? That's Saturday morning feeling. I've got to thank Nicholas hugely, actually. I know he's now rushed off to get his plane. Nicholas, I've known Nicholas for a few years, and we've talked about this stuff, and he's been really formative in what I've been thinking about, and we've been thinking through some of these things together, and it's actually the first time I've seen an update of his work in a while, and it's nice to see where he's taken it, because a lot of the things he's addressing are actually really similar to what I'm looking at, but from a much rawer, more design and art perspective, rather than necessarily an anthropological or social science perspective. So as Michelle said, I'm one of the curators for Impact Festival this year, and we're running that festival in Utrecht in October around this theme of haunted machines, very much looking at the same area of where occult metaphors kind of slip into how we discuss technology and popular culture. And that's come out of a long line of work of about 3 years I've been running with Natalie Kane, starting with a conference at Future Everything, and then we did various small projects, including a radio show that's on exhibition here. But then also in my studio practice and my PhD research, I'm looking at this stuff in a more applied way, so looking at how you can sort of build design or artifacts that kind of bring this conversation into material culture rather than necessarily academic culture. So the piece I've got on exhibition in the White Gallery just there, which you've all seen, is very much looking at this, it's called the Finite State Fantasia. I'm going to talk a little bit about that project. It's very much looking at how do these things actually materialize in the world? How do they actually become real? How do you start to examine why we're using magic through real artifacts? So I called this talk the Hermetic Machine. And Hermeticism is obviously one of the kind of core principles of, not really a principle. It's one of the kind of guiding movements of alchemy. The Hermetic movement was based around this idea that there was a character called Hermes Trismegistus who kind of brought sacred texts from the heavens that taught men men basically, because it was the 1600s, taught men how to do magic and alchemy and astrology and to glean truth from the universe through these technologies, which were seen as technologies. But also Hermetic means sealed, it means closed, it means locked off. So this idea of the black box, this kind of, this technology, this process that's completely obfuscated from human interaction and from human legibility. So I like the idea of those dual meanings, and that's kind of what I'm going to use to guide us through this talk, I suppose. So Hermes Trismegistus, there he is. Very, very little is known about this person. It was speculated that he was an Egyptian prophet who kind of delivered... Has he been mentioned already at the conference? Do I have to do the history of Hermes? Yeah, all right, fine, okay. It's on Wikipedia, though. You can read it all. It's fine. So Hermes Trismegistus, he wrote these texts. They were delivered in ancient Egypt and then rediscovered magically in the 16th century. More likely, probably written by a load of Greek philosophers in around 200, 300 BC, and then dumped around the world. But as a character, he comes from a combination of the Egyptian god Thoth and Hermes from the Greek tradition, from the ancient Greek tradition. And Hermes Trismegistus means thrice great because of, well, there's different speculations about why, but it basically, the combination of magic, alchemy, and astrology being the guiding sort of route to truth. And then Hermes, of course, is super central to alchemy, is the key sort of spiritual figure in alchemy. And the reason for that is that Hermes is seen as the messenger, the one who brings truth. He's seen as a trickster. Hermes is a remarkably multifaceted deity. He's the god of shepherds, travel, borders, merchants, weights and measures, oratory, fertility, luck, literature, athletics, and thievery. Talking about doors, as Nicholas showed, it was often the tradition to have a little Hermes statue by the door because he was the god of sort of passing into different thresholds and different areas. But in the sense that he's the god of process and change, he's also the god of technology. He's the god of turning one thing into another thing or moving something from some place to somewhere else, which kind of makes him this god of technology, and also inherently a kind of god of design, the god of sort of reconstruction, the god of turning something into something else. And it's an interesting idea because alchemy wasn't, well, certainly in the way that I've understood it, alchemy wasn't really about output. It was never really about turning lead into gold or achieving the fountain of youth or whatever. It was about the process. The alchemists wanted to turn lead into gold, not for the sake of getting gold, but to understand how God worked. That was the point. How was stuff made? And that's why many of the chemical sciences kind of evolved from alchemy, just because of the understandings of chemical processes and the material world that were born out of them. So this idea of magic and spiritualism and technology, Nicholas showed loads of stuff on this, so I'm not going to go on about it too long, is kind of fully embedded. It's been there for a long, long time, and it's had a return. There's a great book called Haunted Media by Jeffrey Sconce, which does a more historical overview of this relationship. But with the return of the personal computer, the metaphor really kicked into high gear. Loads of people started using the metaphors of magic and things like that, and the occult, because this was such a weird object. And it's a thing that I've started to call cultural assimilation, which is like, how do you get these new types of objects and technologies into your home, into your life? How do you make sense of them? And the personal computer was essentially a combination of several different types of process. You suddenly had a typewriter, a calculator, a database system, all in one box, which very few people understood its proper functioning. Very few people understood how it was built and how it was made. Lots of people knew how to use it, of course. But when it became something that wasn't just for hobbyists or computer scientists, the marketing had to kick into overdrive to figure out how we tell this technology. So here are some choice kind of adverts from the 70s and 80s. You've got Isaac A. Asimov there, literally one of the sort of golden age sci-fi authors, saying that computers are out of this world, that they're alien. You've got this man being haunted by the poltergeist of email in the middle there. And then you've got Microsoft saying that that Excel is the soul of the machine, which is really tragic, frankly. But saying that it's the soul, which is the seat of power, it's the truth, it's the core of existence. And the reason to use these metaphors, and again, Nicholas talked about this idea of analogy, is that we instantly understand these concepts. We all have seen Disney films, or we've all been to magic shows. We understand what is meant by the soul of the machine. It doesn't require any explaining. If they had a long description, which they kind of do underneath, of what Microsoft Excel actually is, it wouldn't be so, you wouldn't get what it was about so easily. So it's a very kind of easy way of explaining that, and that still goes on today in things like David Rose's work on enchanted objects and Apple's use of magic. William Stahl wrote a paper called Venerating the Black Box, in which he did a semantic analysis of Time magazine articles about the personal computer, and found that 46% of them refer to the personal computer and their founders in terms of the occult. So calling people wizards or referencing that it is a magic machine, whatever it is. David Graeber has a really interesting theory about why this is, which I really like, which is that basically all the guys like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs all played Dungeons and Dragons as kids, which is neat because you have a really complicated mathematical system that has a layer of lore on the top to explain it. So as an idea of why this metaphor in particular, that's a kind of interesting theory. And this still goes on today. You've got Nest, creepy as fuck thing, saying they're the magic of home. Apple's still doing the magical thing, wireless, effortless, magical, lost, whatever it is. Practically Magic. BA this year have decided that flying is magic again, which is good, because that means that this diagram is still valid as a form of kind of technological critique. But in all seriousness, you don't need to know how a plane works, but I'd rather they didn't say it was magic. I'd rather they just said it's really complicated aerodynamics. And the reason for this is quite simple. You've got this black boxing. You've got this hermetic object, which is invisible, or at least illegible from the outside, and therefore requires some explaining of what it does and how it sits in your life. If you think about the gramophone, for instance, both these objects produce music, but if you looked at a gramophone for a few hours maybe, you could pretty much figure out how it works. You could figure out the causal connections that, as Nicholas described, this idea of causality, that this thing leads to this thing, that does this thing, that produces this thing, that makes sound. Whereas with the iPhone, or the iPod, I think this is an iPod, you wouldn't be able to do that. I don't think anyone in this room could do that. I think you'd really very much struggle to understand how sound is coming out of this, much less how it keeps, 5,000, 10,000 songs in it. And that's partly a combination of it being massively technologically complex, but also Apple locking down the intellectual property so that it's almost impossible to find out what's going on inside it. And that leads to this problem of illegibility. So we have the kind of classic Bruno Latourian black box situation, certainly in the iPhone. where you've got stuff going in, something happens, stuff comes out, right? You go to Google, you put in cats, you get cats. Yeah? You all search for cats, right? Yeah. It doesn't really matter because it's so good at doing it. And Latour's original statement is something like, as technology becomes more complex, it becomes more opaque, right? Google is really very good at doing cats. Going to the library to find pictures of cats, deeply inefficient, unsatisfying process. Tried it, it's not fun. But Google, very, very good at cats. What becomes more complex and where the magical thing really starts to creep in is that the black box isn't an isolated black box anymore. Black boxes are now connected and networked, and they live in and exist in a different way. So there will be other people looking into your black box and other people taking things out of your black box. And because it is a black box, you don't know who that is and what they're taking or what they want. And that's everything from government surveillance to ad sort of tracking and things like that. This is all happening, and it makes the black box a different type of object, and that's where it starts to act in strange ways. Again, Nicholas's idea of technological misunderstanding. It starts to do things you didn't necessarily predict because there was a firmware update overnight or something that's changed its behavior. And the other thing about these is that they have a remarkably accurate way of interpreting the universe. So your average smartphone, this guy's happy smartphone, has 19 sensors. It can detect light, but also light, sort of a range of light that humans can't even see. It can detect proximity. It's got 2 or 3 cameras. It's got usually around 3 microphones, including microphones that use ultrasound. It can detect touch. It can position itself by GPS. It's got Wi-Fi, cell networks, near field, Bluetooth, an accelerometer, a magnetometer, a gyroscope, a pressure sensor, and it can detect temperature and humidity. So not only is it connected and networked, but it's also modeling and building this remarkably accurate version of the universe, in your pocket or in your, home or whatever it is. And it exceeds the bounds of what the human sensorium is, right? So what becomes really interesting to me is then how these models start to play back out into the world and how those are then explained away through this magical or mystical sort of set of metaphors. And alchemy, of course, through this idea of unpacking the process by which lead becomes gold or you create the fountain of youth or whatever it is, ended up starting to build a model of the material world, started to build a model of how chemical elements interact with each other. So this is, not a direct outcome of alchemy, but this is Mendelev's first sort of sketch of the periodic table, which is kind of one of these scientific models of how chemicals interact. Based on observation, the data was abstracted and turned into a model of what was assumed to apply for all chemicals and is still being updated and constantly being changed as we discover new things. And James C. Scott writes about this idea of this modeling and abstraction taking 3 stages. The first, we observe the world and we observe behaviors and interactions and use scientific method to kind of figure out how things stick together. We then abstract it, we turn it into a database or an Excel spreadsheet or a periodic table, and then we reapply that model to the world and we reshape the world in the image of the model, which is why the human constructed world looks like this, because the human constructed world reflects the databases that we've built in order to better measure and test and optimize productivity and things like that. These are direct physical shapes put onto the world by software, essentially. If you moved through an airport on your way here, you did the same thing. You moved through what's called a code space. An airport is basically just a big software with a terminal building built around it, right? You're being processed through different channels. You're being directed. You're basically being pushed down a decision tree to end up on the right flight in the right place at the right time. And so the physicality of the airport entirely reflects the software that you're navigating through. And the point of this project that's been going on for, since the 1830s, really, is to centralize power. Whoever can see the Excel spreadsheet, whoever can read the database, whoever has access to the model has the power. They have command and control, and that's a well-established kind of cybernetic theory that we don't really need to debate. But what's really interesting to me is that these models are no longer being built for humans. That because of all the discussions around machine learning and AI, we're starting to realize that the most optimal way of doing things may not be to actually build human legible databases and models of the world. And we're using those incredibly sensitive smartphones to build machine sensitive versions of the world, right? So this is Google's Deep Dream, which I'm sure most people in this room saw, which was the idea that you train a piece of software to dream or to imagine or to create an image, right? So you give it input data, so you give it a load of pictures of dogs in this case, and you ask for output data, which is this picture of the alien meme guy. And then it does a process, but the process is completely illegible to humans. It does a process and it comes up with this strange outcome. And the world is starting to be remodeled based on these ideas of how a machine operates, how a machine cognates the world rather than how humans cognate the world. The best thing, this is a machine learning system doing a series of epochs on handwriting recognition, which I love because you look at this and you think, well, that's in no way anything like handwriting recognition. We can recognize handwriting instantly, and this is doing it in a very, very strange way. But Jenna Burrell wrote an amazing thing about opacity, where she talked about this ongoing debate and sort of technological criticism about opaque systems and what that exactly is and what the different types of opacity are. And she said there are 3 types of opacity. The first opacity is intentional state or corporate secrecy, right? So Apple don't want you to know how your iPhone works because it's part of their intellectual property and they don't want to lose copyright. They don't want other people ripping them off, right? Fine. The second part is opacity as technological illiteracy. So you don't understand how the iPhone works because it's really, really fucking complicated. Yeah? Fine. That's part 2. But the third part is the best bit, is an opacity that arises from the characteristics of machine learning algorithms and the scale required to apply them usefully. And she's talking specifically about machine learning here, but I think you could talk about any technology. In other words, we needed technologies to be so complex and so powerful that we intentionally designed them to be illegible to humans. You know, your iPhone could not be at once legible to you and do all the things that it does. It's impossible. It can't do those 2 things together. So we've designed these things to be illegible. Think back to Excel, right? We can't possibly understand how Excel can add up 64,000 cells in a fraction of a second, because we couldn't do that. We've designed it to be able to do that, and thereby we put it beyond the realms of like what we're cognitively able to relate to. And she sums this up with this really brutal sentence. When a computer learns and consequently builds its own representation of a classification decision, it does so without regard for human comprehension. Yeah, this is where Terminator starts, I think. I think it's like this is like the prequel. It does so without regard for human comprehension. It doesn't care if you understand how it's recognizing handwriting or creating the alien meme guy or sorting all those cells. You know, it's not like the shipping containers and farms. It's never meant to be seen by humans. It's meant to be invisible. And we're starting to see these spaces physicalized in the world. We're starting to see the inklings of these kinds of processes turned into physical things. A good example of this, turn the volume off. A good example of this is Amazon warehouses. Unlike normal warehouses or storage systems that are usually done alphabetically or by type, Amazon has a complete random storage system, because for the machines that generally operate in the factories and for the database that oversees it, the most efficient sorting system is random. Yeah, for a machine, it doesn't make a difference whether all the movies are in alphabetical order or not. The quickest way of doing it is just to put everything in at the top that's new and everything out the bottom that's old. So these warehouses are now completely illegible to humans, and for the last few years, they basically had people working in them with these kind of GPS devices that directed them to the right place, and the system would tell them where to go. But increasingly, they're just entirely run by machines that have a direct connection with this. So this is a physicalization of that type of a database or that type of a mind. Also, how machines move through the world. So this is a Roomba's path, you know, the robotic vacuum cleaner? Yeah? Okay. So how the Roomba moves through a room, right? That's the kind of model of how it does it. It uses what's called a wandering bug algorithm, where it just goes forward until it hits something and then it turns around and moves off in a different direction again. This is like a physicalization of the way that a machine understands the physical universe. When Deep Dream came out, this was kind of dropped a lot more subtly, and not many people took notice of it, but this is Deep Stereo, which came out exactly the same time, and it was the real purpose of Deep Dream. And basically what this is they've taken, it's from the Acropolis Museum in Athens, but they've taken several images in a row through the space and then used interpolation to stitch them together into one continuous movement. Which is completely fascinating, because basically this journey never existed. It's entirely made up by a machine. This is a simulation, a very, very accurate simulation of reality done by a machine, which is completely fascinating and leads to all sorts of questions about about what it means, what the perspective is. This is all taken from a human perspective. It's a roughly human level. It's moving at roughly human speed, but it doesn't have to. The machine may not understand space in this way. It may decide to only stick to the corners or move completely randomly through the space. And so I became really interested in this idea, certainly for this project, about how do these new types of systems and way of cognating start to physicalize into the world. And so I built this project called the Finite State Fantasia, which is next door, which you've all seen, as you said earlier. And it basically is a simulation. It's not playing. It's basically a simulation of a machine mapping a space, based very much on the Roomba's same algorithm, basically a wandering bug algorithm in 3D. So on the left-hand side is a simulated space that's made up in Unity, and this black dot that's moving around very slowly is the machine. And every time it hits something, it makes a new point in this point cloud in the middle. And then from that, we remodel the room on the far right. So it basically tries to remodel the room. And what you can see between the left and the right is the human version of the universe, and on the right-hand side is the machine version of the universe. And the point then is to draw out this massive difference, right? That these machines increasingly, up till now really have kind of been modeling the world, but now we're in stage 3 of that project. They're starting to reshape the world. They're starting to rebuild it. We're getting spaces purposely built by machines and for machines, and that means that the lived experience of the world is going to change dramatically. I started with Hermes, who's the sort of the god of technology and trickery and design and all sorts of things. Quite an exciting fellow. And I wanted to end with a nice little story about him. So one of the things that Hermes did is he was charged by Hera to go and kill Io, who was shagging Zeus. So Io's the cow in the background. And she was shagging Zeus. Hera not very happy about this. He did it all the time, but for some reason Io particularly pissed her off. And anyway, so she sent Hermes, who here is represented as Mercury, because this is after the Roman tradition, and sent Mercury to go and kill Argus Panoptes, from which we get the name Panopticon. And Argus was supposed to have 100 eyes, so he never slept, and he was constantly on guard and could see everything all the time. And so Alexander Galloway has this brilliant kind of quote about this event, where he says, "How does Hermes kill him, this ever-vigilant all-seer? Forever clever, Hermes' strategy is to talk. He begins to talk and continue speaking for hours on end, telling Argus the story of how the reed pipe was invented. During Hermes' tedious monologue, all of Argus's many eyes gradually closed in sleepiness, and his fate is sealed. Argus, in essence, was bored to death by the most boring thing of all, a story about technology." And I'm going to end. Thank you.
Thanks.
No worries.
Checking your watch / wristband. Yeah. Does anyone have any questions? Did we all get lulled to sleep with a boring story about technology?
Or it was just like really clear and accurate. Fine.
Super clear. With your talk and with Nicholas's talk, it seems like there's this the idea of black boxing, the black boxing of technology that creates these superstitions and then also kind of belief systems and things like this. But we are going to get to understand what's happening inside these things. Eventually, it will become more clear as we get more used to these things. We get more acculturated to them. So will that then erase the magic and the awe?
No, I don't know. I agree. I don't think we ever will grow to know more how they actually function. I think if anything, that'll probably decrease, but we will certainly get used to assimilating them easier into culture. Things that were once really terrifying would just become normalized. Like this morning, this massive ransomware attack in the UK, like crazy, but almost straight away everyone's like, all right, yeah, done, normalized, fine, got it. It took 10 minutes before everyone was bored of it. And I think the rate at which we can assimilate new technology because of the kind of cultural craze for growth and innovation and new things all the time means that we may not understand how they actually function and how they're built better, but we certainly get better at not fearing them and assimilating them. And some of the tactics that Nicholas discussed are ways of doing that, how you integrate them with the cultural setup you already have.
Yeah, or maybe we're also operating on a lag. So like maybe we finally understand how to get the VCR to stop blinking 12, but understanding the iPhone is a little tricky.
I think there's going to be at some point, there'll be a roof of like computational power that we hit, which will be really interesting because that then challenges the whole narrative around growth and new technologies and updating. And there will be, I'm sure, a time when people have to become a bit more resilient in terms of like making sure that they're not, it's disposable culture, making sure that we're not constantly just getting the new thing because it exists, but actually starting to critically question more what a thing is for and why we need it, which might be a thing that happens. Yeah. One hopes.
Great. All right, thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.